There we go.
Good.
That's good.
Well, thank you, Father Parkin. It's a humbling experience to be here today, given all the people that have preceded me and their wonderful stories, and for Carrie that will follow me next week. And my journey, as you'll come to understand, is in large part along with my family and my wife, who many of you know that we've been married nearly 45 years at the end of this month. And my son, who's with me today, my oldest son, and his wife and my daughter-in-law, Jennifer. So I'm so pleased they're here to sort of share this journey that I'm going to explain to you in the next few minutes. But as I thought about giving this talk, it's a little bit difficult to talk about your faith because it is so personal. It's really the DNA of your soul. And sort of as I sort of tore into this talk, or thought about this talk with more sensitivity, I came to understand that I'd sort of explain and show some of my own vulnerabilities as I talk about this. And my story starts really at the base of a mountain in Colorado. And as you know, that's where I grew up, and that's called Cheyenne Mountain. And Cheyenne Mountain is about a 10,000-foot tall mountain. It stands as the first mountain you run into. If you start in Kansas and drive west, you'll run into that mountain. Just north of that mountain is Pikes Peak, which was a much larger mountain. It's 14,000 feet. And that was created when these two huge land masses crashed into each other. And it's almost like two automobiles that smack into each other and their hoods bend and buckle. That's what the Rocky Mountains are all about. And that extends far north into Canada and all the way into New Mexico. And just to imagine the forces that were involved with the creation of the Rocky Mountains, and that's where I grew up. Catherine Lee Bates came to Colorado as a young school teacher in the late 1800s, and she wrote a poem to Pikes Peak, and it started off, "Oh, beautiful for halcyon skies," and she changed it later saying, "Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains' majesties, God shed his grace on thee." And that's where I grew up. And during the summers, you'd look out at the sky and you'd see the entire Milky Way. And in August, you'd see the meteorites come through the skies as the Earth passes through the Perseid meteorite shower. And that's where John Denver, many years later, would write, "I've seen fire raining in the sky, talk to God, and listen to his casual reply." The fire raining in the sky was actually those meteorites that he had seen. And I remember when I grew up, I had my first self-awakening and awareness. And I was probably 10 years old, and I realized that I was a living, breathing human being and that I was separate and distinct from others. And that I needed a purpose in my life, and why was I here? It's a question that all of us have, when we first remember that time. And I was probably 10 or 11 years old. My parents went to a local Episcopal church in Colorado Springs. It was housed in an estate that was given to the church by a robber baron, an industrialist, the first part of the last century. And the parish house and the great hall was in the manor house, and the church itself was held in the carriage house. And the carriage house was truly a carriage house. That's where the carriages were housed. That's where the horses were housed. And it was later converted so that it would be for cars. And that fact was never lost on me because Christ was born in a stable. And our first churches was held in folding chairs. They were folding chairs in this large sort of garage. And it eventually was renovated, and when it was renovated, it had pews put in it. And the far west end of the church or the building was the sacristy, and that was a marble altar, and the marble was from Colorado, of course. And instead of having a stained glass window, it had a clear bevel glass window. And so you could look through that bevel glass windows and look into the mountains. And that's why I would always remember the psalm that starts off, "I lift my eyes up into the hills. From where does my help come from? It comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth." And so my first formation of my faith was based upon the external world, the grandeur of Colorado, the grandeur of the mountains, that there must be something greater in my life. Well, as I started to explore with my friend, I had a snuffy equivalent like Dr. Hardman. So I had a snuffy equivalent, and we would sort of explore the environs of Cheyenne Mountain. And if I went a little bit to the north, I would go into this ravine, and in the ravine, if you looked in the right layer of dirt, you could find seashells. And these are seashells from an inland sea that had existed millions of years prior, that had become fossilized. As the earth lifted up, the animals were trapped in this shallow sea, and they were buried in the mud and became fossils. And then later I would go down to the south of where I lived, and there was a large ranch called Star Ranch, of all things. And Star Ranch was probably a cattle ranch, although what I'll tell you is probably not consistent with a cattle ranch. I found a bunch of bones with my snuffy equivalent, and these bones are just like you think in the West. You know, you see these cow bones that are bleached from the sun. Well, this was a much smaller animal that I found, and finding that skeleton probably sealed my fate for the rest of my life. And so Snuffy didn't want anything to do with the skeleton, but I collected the skeleton and brought it home. And it was more than one animal. And it was several animals. There's one skull, but it was probably, as I look back on it, sheep that were sort of captured maybe in a late winter storm like this, and had died together as they huddled. And I took that skeleton and I put it together and wired it together. And in those days, you didn't have Google, you had Britannica America. So I got up my Britannica encyclopedia and looked through it. And I assembled this animal, built a stand for it, and entered it in a science fair. And I got honorable mention. And then as I look back on it, I figured out what I did wrong. I took the sternum and made a tailbone out of it. So, but that started me down a course of science. And as I looked at that animal, I started to see that there was enormous similarities between me and that animal. And if you go to a history of Natural History Museum, the Field Museum, for example, that animal had 7 vertebrae in its neck. I have 7 vertebrae in my neck. So does a giraffe. My forearms have 2 bones. My calves have 2 bones. So do all the animals in the natural kingdom have 2 bones. So do their hands, their shoulder blades, their hip bones. It's very similar. And so I started to have the perspective of the interconnectedness of life, how all we are connected. And later, when the human genome was fully explored, I share about 90% of my genes with my dog. Ernie and I are very attached. And so that goes to the showing that we are so similar and so interconnected. And it's over time. And later in college, you'd be challenged a lot of those theories with Darwin and evolution, and then later by Richard Dawkins, who was an atheist, who was an evolutionary biologist, who challenged the notion of creation. And throughout my life, there's always been this tension between science and religion. But in my perspective, we're all interconnected, and the whole gift of life is what centers us. And there's this notion called theist evolution, that everything was set in our universe so that we were to exist. And sometimes people talk of God in the gaps, like where we don't know knowledge, that's where God is. Well, over time, those gaps will be filled in. So my argument is that God exists in the constants in these equations. And the most famous equation is Einstein's equation on relativity, E equals mc squared. Well, why is it squared? Maybe that's God. Maybe that squaring of the velocity of life is why we exist. And so there's the head of the NIH now is a man named Francis Collins, who's a devout Episcopalian. And he shares a lot of the same beliefs that I do. And little did I know it until I read his book recently, The Language of God. But it's the same notion, is that the formation of our universe and the creation of our life was the setting of the parameters exactly by God. It's not as if Richard Dawkins had said that it's a blind watchmaker. If you try a million times, you'll come up with human beings. That's not the case. It's too unremarkable for this to have occurred. And sometimes I use the example, if you go back 2 or 3 generations and think of your grandfather, your great-grandfather, would they predict that you'd be here with me talking about this subject? The chances of that happening are infinitely small. So that was the formation of a lot of my beliefs of our lives, and that would later be challenged as I went on to medical school. And the reason I went to medical school was my dad worked in a hospital as an accountant. My mom worked for some doctors in a doctor's office. And my dad worked in a Catholic hospital. And Catholic hospitals became very close to one of the nuns that ran it, the Sisters of Charity. And it only made sense to me that my interest in science would be married in medicine, that you could give back, and my purpose in life would be through medicine. And but that would be a little bit more challenged as I went into medical school. But that was sort of the driving force of why I went to medical school, was the marriage of religion and medicine, and it just all seemed to fit. So when I went to medical school, it was probably my first experiences with death. You have human anatomy course, which most takes people back, but then there was also the death of Anne's brother at a very early age and my father. And so at that time, there was a book by Kubler-Ross that talked about death and dying. But that sort of put death off in sort of an academic framework, and it didn't seem real and familiar to me. And later there would be a book by Sherman Newland, who was a surgeon at Yale, and he talked about how we die, but it was done in a very academic way. And I didn't really experience death as much until I entered my residency. And I started my residency as internal medicine, but I changed my residency to surgery in the following year. And the residencies in those days were relatively inhumane to the resident. There were no work hours, because now there's work hours. You're only allowed to work 80 hours. But in those days, I was on call every other night. So the surgery started at 7:30 in the morning, bang. And that meant you had to get to the hospital probably around 6, a little before 6, make your pre-rounds, get everything set for the operating room. Surgery would start at 7. You'd operate all day long. Then after surgery, you'd tuck the patients in bed, check the patients who were on the ward, and then get home about 10:30 at night. The next day would be the same thing, except you'd stay in the hospital. You wouldn't go home. So Anne was literally a single mom and sort of raised the family without me being present, which was really a great blessing in my life. But during my residency, a lot of my early work was in trauma. And so my early residency was at the Denver General Hospital, which was very much like Cook County. And so we had the Denver Knife and Gun Club. The Denver Knife and Gun Club became very active on the weekends. And what I learned from that early experience in my residency was, one, life was very fragile. It could be lost in an instant. And that man was fairly inhumane to man. There was just enormous inhumanity as you saw people being shot and stabbed and all kinds of mayhem. And the irony of much of that is my Cheyenne Mountain that I grew up next to, the military drilled a big hole in it and put in a bunker to protect the armed forces from a nuclear attack. So in these days of the Syrian war and all those things, I think about the inhumanity that man expresses to one another and wonder why that is and why they don't see the world as I do. And I think maybe they've forgotten those questions of why they exist and why we are who we are. So during my residency and up until just recently, because I'm going to retire this summer, every Friday, for the most part, we had something called M&M. M&M stands for mortality and morbidity. So that's a conference that surgeons do from time immemorial till now. And so we would get together every Friday and talk about morbidities, which are complications, and mortalities, which were deaths. And so during my training, I would have, and even into my early career, people would die before surgery, during surgery, or after surgery. And the hardest ones were the ones that died during the operations. And you tried to analyze those as best you could of why the patient died and what you could do differently or had a complication to make things different. Along about that time, there was a cartoonist from Evanston. His name was Gahan Wilson. And he wrote a lot of cartoons for the New Yorker and Playboy, and they were these sort of ghoulish pictures. And I had one that hung on my office for years, and the image was of the soul of a person leaving the operating room table, ascending into heaven, looking back at the surgeons struggling below saying, "Gee, Doc, I appreciate your efforts, but the matter is solved." And that was some support to me because of the procedures that I did carried a certain risk of mortality to patients. And so that hung on my wall for years. Later I worked in different hospitals, and many of my favorite hospitals were ones that had a religious background. As you know, there's Barnes Jewish Hospital, there's St. Luke's and Houston's, there's St. Francis and Christ and Advocate. So many of these hospitals had a religious background to them. In a Catholic hospitals, in the operating room, there was often a portrait of a surgeon and the scrub nurse there operating on a patient, and between them was Christ. And that always gave me strength when I was remembering that picture. And eventually I had a copy of that picture in my operating room. And that was also true that in some of these more difficult operations that I did, I would have the presence of God along with me, or Christ. So that was always very comforting. And now I just have a simple cross in my office. One of the things that has happened to not churches, but to hospitals over time is that the presence of religion has sort of evaporated. And during one of my child's illnesses and sicknesses, the only visible presence of God at that church was Jason and Father Chris, who were there during that time. And the Stephen ministry and the chaplains are so powerful in these day and ages when hospitals are no longer giving and from their original purposes, but now to almost the generation of revenue. It has changed so dramatically. And today, more than ever, physicians have a high rate of burnout. Alcoholism is greater now in physicians than it's ever been. And I think the reason for that is the lack of purpose. And in fact, I had a survey sent to me by one of the governing bodies of medicine, sort of trying to dissect out what's causing this high rate of burnout. A lot of people blamed it just on electronic medical records. There's a lot of guys like me who can't type, and you have to play with a computer, and it's like the frustration that builds up from it. But I think it's far more than that. I think it's the loss of purpose to a greater cause that has caused a lot of physicians to leave medicine today. So that's what the hospitals have changed in my own practice. Now I want to tell you a couple of stories, and I'm sorry this is going to be so darn brief. I thought it was going to be longer when I practiced it, but maybe I spoke too quickly, Annie. In my clinical practice, I had the scientific practice, and I did research at the NIH, and I had grants, and I would travel to the NIH probably twice a year for 10 or 15 years. I go to the NIH. And that's in Rockville or Bethesda, which sits outside of Washington, D.C. And so that's usually a two-day meeting. And at the end of that meeting, I'd try to finish it up earlier and catch a cab to the National Cathedral. And I'd run down to the cathedral on the way home and sit in the back of the church. And I had very simple prayers. And I had a preamble, and the preamble was first to thank the Lord for all my blessings. The second was to make me a better person. And the third was to pray for people that were ill, my family members, or even my patients on occasion. And I've used this church on many occasions. Early in the morning, prior to going to work, there's nobody here at 5 o'clock in the morning or 6 in the morning. Somebody taught me that very early in my life was that nobody really cares where you are at 5 in the morning. So that's when I would get to the hospital early, because nobody really cares where you are then. So that was part of my NIH experience, and it's always been a part of my experience to spend some time in a church wherever I am, just quiet, alone by myself. Well, there's three more stories that I like to talk about. One of my roles in surgery, and that consumed about 80 or 90% of my time, was to take care of problems that arose in the operating room that the operating surgeon couldn't handle. And so on one occasion, I was called to see a patient that was being operated on for another condition. The surgeon had been working a good part of the day, and towards the end of the day, he ran into some trouble and got some bleeding that he couldn't control. So I came to the operating room, and the patient had, just barely detectable blood pressure and uncontrolled hemorrhage. And for the next several hours, I spent time trying to get control of the situation and the patient back to health. And finally, we got the bleeding controlled and the damage repaired. And the patient made a recovery slowly. And probably 2 or 3 weeks into our hospital course, one of the residents called me and said, the patient wants to see you. And I thought that was sort of interesting because there was another surgeon that had started the operation. So I went in to see her, and she asked me to come in without my entourage of residents and interns, and she asked me to sit down and talk to her. And she said she knew that I was there. And I said, how did you know that I was there? She said, I knew you were there. She said during that period of time that she had seen the white light, she had one of these after-death experiences. She had the out-of-body experiences. She sensed that I was there. She knew when I came in the room who I was. And she said that, interestingly, both in excitement and some trepidation. She was excited to tell someone, but she didn't want someone to tell me that it wasn't real. And I said, yeah, I think that was probably true. So she gave me a hug, and I never saw her again. So she had this near-death experience that was very similar to what you've read about. Fast forward about 10 years now. 10 years later, I have another woman that's transferred to me, and I can give you her name because she has a website. It's Penny Fisher. She was in California, and she came down with toxic shock syndrome. And toxic shock syndrome is an overwhelming infection of the body in which all the organs shut down. So for about 3 months, she lay in a coma in California. She was flown back to Chicago, and then she came under my care at that point. And I did a number of operations on Penny, and she eventually got herself back together and back to her family. So then a couple more years go by, and I stayed in touch with Penny. And Penny called me one day, and she said, would you be on the Steve Harvey show? I said, the Steve Harvey show? I said, okay. It was important to her. She was a model and a beautiful woman before what had befell her. And I said, sure. And I said, tell me what I have to do. And they said, well, the producer will call you and let you know. So I said, okay. So it's about 2 weeks before the Steve Harvey event. It was a Mother's Day program. So she's on this program, and they had 2 physicians that took care of her. The first physician, they asked the question, and they told me the question ahead of time. The first question to the first person is, what's toxic shock syndrome and what does it cause? And you can bet your bottom dollar what the next question was. They asked me what they thought about her out-of-body experience. She had an out-of-body experience where she was in a garden, where she had visits from different people, and she had a voice that came to her and asked her if she wanted to stay or come. This is all on her website, and I didn't give you that piece of the story. So here I am, a scientist with all this background and trying to sound like a professor of surgery at Northwestern. So what am I going to answer to that question? So I'm sitting in this little room. They keep you in, it's called the green room or something. They stuff you in this little room, and they put powder on your forehead so you don't shine. for us, Sandy, that's, you can understand. They put powder up here so you don't shine on TV. So I had, is it some sort of inner brain release of hormones that cause these events to occur? I was trying to think for the soul of me what to say. So sitting in that room, it came to me. So they haul me out onto stage with this other doctor, and they ask her question. And they asked me my question, and I said, heaven's for real. And then I told them the experience with my other patient. I said, heaven's for real. And that was about the same time that movie occurred as well. Steve Harvey sort of mumbled away, and I couldn't remember the end of the thing, but it's on TV. So I was walking back from the NBC Tower to the hospital at Northwestern. And I'm walking down that street and thinking, well, was that my whole purpose in life? Was that it? To be on Steve Harvey and say, heaven's for real? So as I thought about that walking down the street, I said, I wish I could have a do-over, because I would say, heaven's for real, Christ is real, God is real. That's the do-over I wish I had. But maybe that wasn't the end of it because I'm still living and I'm still here, so maybe that wasn't the end of my total purposes. But some people ask why I became a surgeon, and that's a really difficult question, and I only answered that as I thought about it for this presentation. I went on a mission to North Dakota on Standing Rock. And at Standing Rock, you're building stuff, using your hands, constructing stuff and building it. And one of my partners says, why do you do that? I mean, you make a lot of money to operating. Why don't you just give that money to the church and let them build it? I mean, why don't you just do that? If you're altruistic, that makes a whole lot more sense. Just give the money and spend your time doing what you're good at. And I said, well, that's sort of true. But then I went on the Kentucky mission and did the same thing. I've done on occasion the soup kitchen. And then on occasion I've done Kamali. My wife does the shawl ministry and the altar ministries. So what is it about the physicality of doing something for another person? There's something physical that's rewarding by doing these things that's above and beyond what you get monetarily or otherwise. And it's not really altruistic, whatever it is. And I think it's that inner peace of God in each of us trying to react and reach out to the other person next to us. And I think that's probably why Jason gives his hugs, is that inner physicality reaching out to another human being. So this has been a long tale, and I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been self-revealing to give this Easter presentation, and I've given you a clear insight into how I value life and how really precious it is. Thank you.